Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome back to the channel. So in today's lecture, we will discuss a bit more into details of dispatcher servlet and request mapping, and additionally add a new controller and move this configurations into another controller. We also saw how dispatcher servlet is configured because of the Spring Boot starter dependencies, and it's configured to the first forward slash. We'll change that dispatcher servlet configuration and try to play around with this config in this particular video. So let's begin. First of all, let's try to run the application once, so see if everything is fine. Okay, so the application is started on port 8080, and initializing is servlet Spring embedded web application context happened on the first forward slash. Let's try to invoke the endpoint, say hello, and initializing dispatcher servlet, and it did give us a response. Let's try to invoke hello world, and it is giving us a response. Maybe let's try to invoke hello world 1. So it says was not able to find this, right? This is something which we have already seen. Now let's try to play around with this a bit. Okay, let's say normally you will have multiple controllers. You can have multiple controllers with Spring Boot. We work with Spring Boot microservices normally, so they are intended to do one thing and do it very well. But anyway, you can definitely have more than one controller in an application, and it makes sense to move the correct methods or request mapping to the correct controller. So in our current controller class, we have hello and hello world. So let's see how it works when we try to move this hello world into its own controller. So let's create a new class. We'll just say it's a hello world controller. Okay, and let's annotate it. Okay, and this should be just picking up the imports, and let's directly copy, basically let's cut it from there and move it to this class. Okay, so we moved the hello world method from hello controller to hello world controller class. Okay, let's see. So basically there is just a new door that is now present in your application, and it is present at a different Java class, which again we have annotated with @rest controller. So let's try to run this. See, we will see if there is any difference. Okay, so the application was already running. Let me stop it. Okay, so, okay. Again we see Tomcat localhost Spring Web application context, and now let's try to invoke the hello world API, which is in a different controller. And we see that initializing Spring dispatcher servlet happened on the first forward slash, and wherein dispatcher servlet access the first front controller. And let's invoke the get API for hello, and both the APIs are working even if they are available in different two controller classes, because anything after this first forward slash is kind of invocable directly when you hit the endpoint, and dispatcher servlet can automatically delegate the API call to the correct controller class. Now let's take this a bit further, and let's configure some request mappings more. Okay, so let's do one thing. Let's say this hello world controller, okay, sits behind a different request mapping. Let's say request mapping to be let's say hello world controller. Just using it for a example, and let's change it to request mapping. Start this. So this hello world controller and then hello world. Okay, so reach the hello world controller, ideally it should go to hello world controller and then it should go to hello world. Let's see if this works. And the normal hello controller has no additional request mapping that are given at the rest controller level. Okay, let's see how it works. So nothing changed in terms of logs for us. Let's invoke the hello controller, and it's working as expected. What happens when we invoke the hello world? See, it's not able to find hello world directly because we added another request mapping behind which the get hello world is present. So let's try to correct our URI. Okay, let's say let's remove this extra, and we are now able to invoke the hello world. So basically, at the first level, we have the dispatcher servlet. Then we are saying that whenever you want to invoke anything within hello world controller, you need to have a request mapping in your URL. Basically, your URL needs to contain this hello world controller, and then it can invoke any other methods that are present in this controller. So basically, hello world method sits behind the hello world controller path, and which sits behind the front controller, which is our dispatcher servlet. Okay, which the request mapping that we did in this class kind of did not impact anything with respect to the hello controller. So let's recheck it. Okay, so we have hello. So we can say that the dispatcher servlet was present at the first forward slash, and then we kind of created which we if we remove if we remember the same analogy wherein the first door to your home or to the living room of your home is kind of the entrance to your to that particular room is kind of dispatcher servlet, and then you it allows access to different parts of your home via doors. So hello world is one of such doors. So herein what we have done after the first dispatcher servlet, we have introduced another request mapping behind which your hello world sits. Okay, so normally with Spring Boot you have a property by which you can configure the dispatcher servlet, but again if you want to separate out the request mapping that are present in your application, this is one of the way that you can achieve it. So let's say in your application you have a employee and you might have a user. You want to separate out all the request mapping for employee and user, so you can create a request mapping over at the controller level which says employee, and then within the methods you can say get resource or maybe post resource, update resource, patch resource, or whatever, and you can just reuse the similar code or similar request mappings for the user controller, and over there you will have the request mapping at the controller level which starts with user. So this way your different APIs sit behind different controllers as well as different endpoints or request mappings. Okay, now let's see how it works. Maybe we'll introduce another request mapping in hello controller class, and let's say we'll call it hello 2. Okay, so that this would be hello 2. Let's say hello 2 and then hello 2. Okay, and now we are making change to the hello controller class. Okay, so it has initialized everything. Let's try to run it. It's completed initialization. Dispatcher servlet is configured at the first forward slash. And whatever we invoke the new API, everything is working fine. And since there is no additional request mapping, so they basically sit behind the first forward slash. Let's try to play around with this a bit more. Okay, with for hero controller, we have no additional request mapping defined. For hello world controller, we have defined additional request mapping wherein all the endpoints within this particular class will sit behind the hello world controller. So let's introduce another method over here. Let's say we'll say hello world from India, and we'll invoke it. Okay, let's just reuse the same variable. Okay, we need the first of all the controller path as well additionally, and okay, so right, hello world from India is behind hello world controller, so we are able to invoke it. And if we just move out the controller, let's see what happens. The request mappings, let's see what happens. So it says it doesn't know where to invoke. Oh sorry, There's one extra hello here. Okay, okay. So it is not able to decide which get method to basically invoke this. Let's try to stop this and maybe remove one of the request mappings and see if this also works. Okay, let's see what happens then. Again, it is not working. So basically you were able to reach to this particular path, but we since we did not specify anything which we did not specify the next method that we have to reach, it is not able to reach out. Okay, now what we'll do is we'll create a dispatcher servlet configuration which will be kind of configuring additional details. So the first forward slash will introduce some other additional details for the dispatcher servlet, and then your endpoints will further sit behind this request mapping that we will configure for dispatcher servlet. Then it will come for the request mapping at the controller, and then finally it will reach to the request mapping at the method level. Okay, so let's try to configure that. So with Spring Boot, there is a property called server.server context hyphen path, wherein we can configure this particular property to some values. So in our case, let's say it is demo. Okay, we will see as soon as we configure this path, we will see that there is a difference in the log that happens when it is initializing the dispatcher servlet. So let's try to bring up the application. Okay, the application has come up, but you see there is a demo that is introduced, demo after the first forward slash. Okay, so let's try to hit the hello controller first. Okay, so now we have a dispatcher servlet that is configured at this part, and our hello controller is behind the dispatcher servlet, so it is able to return us from slash demo slash hello path, and same goes for the hello 2 controller. But if you see, we have another request mapping which is for hello world controllers. So let's try to also invoke it. Now first let's fail it. So we don't hit the dispatcher servlet directly. We hit the endpoint which was previously configured as dispatcher servlet, so it doesn't work. Now we are still you reaching out to dispatcher servlet, but we doesn't know which method or which API to invoke. So let's give it some more value. Let's say we want to invoke hello world. Okay, and right, it is now able to invoke it. So it works in this manner that first your dispatcher servlet should be present, dispatcher servlet path should be present. Then if you have specified anything at the controller level for the request mapping, that should be present, and finally the request mapping that is present, that is applicable for your method, that should be applied. So this is how you can actually configure dispatcher servlet. Okay, some other values using this particular property which starts from server.servlet.context hyphen path. You can configure it. By default it is defaulted to this first forward slash. Then you can differentiate between the URIs or the paths in your application on the at the controller level, wherein you can define a request mapping, and all the methods in that controller will sit behind this particular request mapping. Additionally, if you don't need such extra configurations, you can just do without it. So there is no requirement to specify a request mapping specifically for controllers. It will still work directly. This endpoint can directly be invoked right after the dispatcher servlet configuration. Okay, so this is how we using the same or one sort of configuration for dispatcher servlet, you can have multiple invocation or multiple doors that kind of open up to different endpoints or different URI. So basically you can have employee, user, or different sort of as per your business logic application, whatever business logic your application wants. You can have different endpoints sitting behind different doors, and then all together it sits behind the main dispatcher servlet, which you can configure it once over here. There are other ways also to with the Java code that you can register dispatcher servlet, but again it will be too much of code for to achieve the same things that you can achieve from a request mapping point of view. So we can have multiple sort of dispatcher servlet configurations, basically saying if you just define the request mapping at the control level, it kind of will work in the same way that dispatcher servlet works, and you can have multiple configurations as per the controllers that are present in your application. So this is how we can work around with the dispatcher servlet in Spring Boot. Okay, and we saw different ways that we can configure the dispatcher servlet, and also saw how the log change. This is the property specifically for that. By default we don't need to configure it, it's defaulted to the first forward slash. Okay, and going forward we'll play around a bit more. We'll also look at the different request mappings, and how can we play around with the path variables. Okay, and how does actually a JSON object that you can send from an UI gets transformed into a Java object on the fly, basically seeing how does that Jackson to object mapper works. And seen here, if you see, there is no exception that is defined. So whenever you try to use an object mapper, you will need to handle, or you need to say that we have thought about the JSON processing exception. But in here you don't see anything like that. We'll discuss a bit more on the post mappings, wherein this will come in handy. We'll also discuss a few other APIs related to HTTP, and then move on to the next part of the Spring Boot internals. Okay, that's all for today's session. Thank you. Thanks for joining.